Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York, MAC. Today, of course, is Tuesday, February 10th, 2026. This, of course, is the spring 2026 semester. This week, we begin a two-part discussion on how global trade is managed among nations. We will conclude the two-part discussion next week with a review of the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, as well as the history of these institutions and their different roles. Before we continue, it would be instructive that I also acknowledge that the credibility of these institutions is now being put to the test by many of the same countries. And this is the big paradox. They're being put into test by many of the same countries that brought about their existence, inarguably have prospered economically because of the international order. That said, let us now address the learning objectives for this week by interrogating the following questions. So these are your learning objectives for the week. And if you're able to respond correctly and effectively to these questions, as I'm about to do right now, then you've really mastered the learning objectives for the week. The first objective is to differentiate between different errors in the theory of trade and their underlying themes. It is important to note the economic outcomes of theories of trade across the eras we shall cover inform the international political economy's evolution towards a liberal order, despite current tensions in the rules-based international trade system. Of course, the liberal order means that it means a belief in international institutions, international rules, and norms that guide trade and other international relations. As example, consider the recently announced US government Forge initiative on critical minerals. Forge proposes to bring about 55 countries into strategic cooperation on critical minerals and to reduce their reliance on China. So this is really one of the clear examples that eventually, to create shared prosperity, countries have to come together and cooperate based on rules and norms. Eventually, it comes down to that, I think. Um, the US government has also proposed Project Vault to create critical minerals strategic reserve that is backed by US Exim Bank loans. Indeed, today's lecture will offer informative theoretical and historical foundation for many of today's argument on the Trump administration's international trade tariff, the arguments pro or con. The mercantilist period. The origins of international political economy are closely associated with the development of modern European states and their global markets. The modern European state gained official recognition at the Treaty of Westphalia, which marked the defeat of the Catholic Habsburg countries by mostly Protestant countries in Northern Europe. The Treaty of Westphalia upheld state sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is critical. The Treaty of Westphalia, which came into effect in 1648, that marked the defeat of the Catholic Habsburg countries by mostly Protestant countries in Europe, did a number of things. It upheld the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states by institutionalizing changes to prevent external religious and secular authorities, i.e., the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and other states from interfering in a state's internal affairs. Now, I did promise from the first week of class that I'm going to try to draw parallels and connections between the theories and historical events that we study in class and current events that is ongoing. To that effect, the European Union's fierce opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's attempt to forcefully redraw Ukraine borders can be argued to trace back to the spirit of the Treaty of Westphalia. Remembering that the Treaty of Westphalia, which came into effect in 1648, um, forbade other countries from interfering in another state's uh, internal affairs. And of course, uh, that other states must respect the territorial integrity of other states. A major factor enabling the state to establish its authority vis-a-vis internal and external forces was the development of mercantilism. Mercantilists were actually aware of the linkage between politics and economics, viewing both power and wealth as essential goals of national policy. The mercantilist states could use their wealth to build up their armed forces, hire mercenaries, and influence their enemies and allies. As such, mercantilists sought trade advantages over their other countries in the following ways. First, mercantilists increased their exports and decreased imports of manufactured goods. Second, mercantilists will seek to restrict raw material and technology exports to prevent others from developing manufacturing capabilities. And third, mercantilist states will import raw materials they needed to reduce costs for their own manufacturers. Colonialism was central to mercantilism because the colonies provided the metropole or the colonizing country with raw materials and served as markets for its finished products, goods, and services. As such, manufacturing in the colonies was usually prohibited. The Industrial Revolution and British hegemony is the second error. Mercantilism, as the term is used in the class textbook, is a pre-industrial doctrine. The Industrial Revolution, which began at about 1780, affected only some manufacturers and means of production, and initially progressed from region to region rather than involving entire countries. However, Britain became the hegemonic power in the 19th century, and as it was the first state to industrialize. By 1860, Britain accounted for about 37% of European industrial production, 20% of world industrial production, and 80% of newer technologies. Britain shifted from mercantilist policies to free trade by removing most of its industrial restrictions. By the 1830s and in 1846, it replaced the Corn Laws, which had restricted agricultural imports. The third error. So again, um, once countries had a theory of economic engagement, which was really short-sighted, right? Which is the mercantilist period. And the theory of the mercantilist period, the economic theory was really fairly simple. I'm going to make stuff, and I'm going to want you to buy the stuff that I make. And I'm going to do everything possible to restrict and constrain your ability to also make the same stuff and therefore compete with me. You could quickly see the challenge with this. For me to profit from the things that I make, you, the other countries, have to be what is called in economics effective consumers. That is a consumer that has money to consume. For you to have money to consume, you also have to make some other stuff that I would want to buy. Because it's sort of like a supermarket owner who wants to own all other businesses in the town and only want people from his family to work in all the businesses in the town. So you buy up all these businesses, You fire everybody and only hire your own family. You're going to run into a problem very quickly. You're going to realize that it doesn't matter how good your goods and services are, people are unemployed, they can't afford it. So you would need a degree of prosperity for others to be able to purchase your goods and or services. And this is really the inherent shortcoming and the short-sightedness many economists would argue with the mercantilist philosophy. Eventually, if you are able to monopolize all the factors of production and all the production capacity, if your people who are supposed to be your customers are too broke, well, they're not your customers because much as they might like what you sell, they can't afford it. So you have to allow an international system that also allows for prosperity to be spread. But we're going to unpack that a little bit more as we go along. So the British quickly realized that, so they moved into more free trade during the first industrial revolution, right? And um, that effectively ended the mercantilist period uh, uh, for for British and global economy. So the first era is the mercantilist period. The second era is the first industrial revolution when Britain was the hegemonic power. And the third era is what we're about to discuss, which is the decline of British hegemony and World War One. The growth of trade became slower in the late 19th century due to depressed economic conditions, especially industrial protectionism on the European continent and a decline of British hegemony. This decline, due to decrease in Britain's productivity relative to the United States and Germany, made Britain less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other countries' export. The third learning objective for this week is to identify and explain the underlying philosophies of different theories of international trade, to which you can think of it this way. Theories of international trade tend to explain the nature and movement of international trade. Such theories can be classified into one, classical country-based theories. These include mercantilism, as we've explained, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So let's unpack this. Again, the theory of mercantilism, as I explained, this theory gained ascendancy during the 16th to 19th century, when the wealth of nations was measured by its accumulated wealth in terms of gold and silver. As previously mentioned, mercantilism encourages countries to accumulate wealth by encouraging exports and discouraging imports. Theory of mercantilism aims to create trade surplus, which in turn accumulates a nation's wealth. But again, remember what I just said, that can quickly reach a dead end, because if you accumulate all the trade advantages, you are by definition impoverishing your trade partners. And if your trade partners are poor, then they can't purchase from you. And if they can't purchase from you, then eventually you yourself become poor and it becomes what they call a global depression. So, what are the other economic alternatives to the global order? To understand one theory, it's called the absolute advantage theory. This theory originates from Adam Smith's his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. According to this theory, when one country can produce a unit of good with less cost, i.e., cheaper or faster than another country, the first country has an absolute cost advantage in producing that good. And that country should then produce that good and sell it to others and let the other countries produce the goods that they have absolute advantage in producing. But that idea was expounded into a theory that is called comparative advantage theory. Remember, the other one is absolute advantage, and this one is comparative advantage theory. And this theory originates from David Ricardo's book, The Principle of Political Economy and Taxation, which was published in 1817. In this book, Ricardo argues that nations can still gain from trade, even without an absolute advantage in the manufacture or production of anything. According to the theory, a country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good relative to other goods is lower in comparison to other countries. Comparative advantage focuses on the relative productivity difference, whereas absolute advantage looks at absolute productivity. One way to think of this is to simplify the logic of this theory, which is think about this for a second. What if one person in a small town is the best physician in that town, and indeed the only physician in that town? But that physician is also the best barber in that town. Not the only barber, but the best. Now, there are only 8 working hours in the day. That physician can decide to say, you know what, I'm going to cut hair for 8 hours. Opportunity cost is what that person has to give up to cut hair. So, obviously, physicians make a lot more money than barbers. All things being equal, physicians are a lot more important to society than barbers. We can go without getting a haircut, but when we have an emergency situation, we need a physician. If we don't get one, we're probably not going to survive it. But we all can survive a bad hair day. In fact, I don't have a hair day, so it's a little different. So you got to then figure out for that society, what is the opportunity cost for that barber for that person to work as a barber instead of a physician? You will quickly realize that both that individual and the small town they live in are better off allowing that person who is the best barber to go ahead and practice as a physician and let the second best barber be the town's barber. Because the price that individual has to pay if they want to be a barber instead of a physician, and the price that little town has to pay for no longer having a physician is way higher than the benefit of having the best barber cut hair. So that is the logic of comparative advantage. You can then think about this with respect to bigger things. Let's say flip-flop. It costs rent in New York City, as an example. It's maybe cheap rent in New York City is about $1,500, maybe for one bedroom if you're lucky, maybe even $2,000. So if the average person in New York City has a choice to work at a job where they make $50,000 a year or work at a job where they make flip-flops, realize that flip-flops in the summer at Target is about $1.99. So they can only pay the person so much if the product they turn out costs $1.99. And if they're paying that person, let's say $5 an hour, they're never going to be able to afford an apartment. You can see how the economic pressures would say to New York City, although we can make the best flip-flop in the world, we might be better off letting people in Alabama where rent is cheaper, make flip-flops, and we will make other things that can sell for more money because like the cost of living in the city is just too expensive. So it's not like New Yorkers can't make flip-flops if they choose to, but the opportunity cost of making that flip-flop is such that it would undermine the economic system of New York City. So this is essentially the the broader understanding of what a comparative advantage is. So you don't always make the things that you're the best at. You make the things that you're the best at, given other things you might need to give up, right? So the third theory is called endowment theory, right? Or factor proportions theory. They also call it Heckscher-Ohlin model. According to this theory, a nation will export the commodity whose production requires intensive use of the nation's relative abundance and cheap factors, and import the commodities whose production requires intensive use of the nation's scarce and expensive factors. Thus, a country with an abundance of cheap labor would export labor-intensive products and import capital-intensive goods, and vice versa. On the other hand, modern firm-based theories include country similarity, product life cycle, global strategic rivalry, and Porter's national competitive advantage. Again, let's quickly unpack these. Product life cycle theory, due to a variety of factors, international markets tend to follow a cyclical pattern, which explains the shifting of markets, as well as the location of production. Of note, the level of innovation and technology, resources, size of market, and competitive structure in combination influence trade patterns. In addition, the gap in technology and the preference of customers in international markets also determine the stage of international product life cycle. Theory of competitive advantage in international trade. So there are two things. Don't confuse competitive advantage with comparative advantage. So, as propounded by Michael Porter in The Competitive Advantage of Nations, the theory of competitive advantage concentrates on a firm's home country environment as the main source of competencies and innovation. This model is often referred to as the diamond model, wherein four determinants interact with each other, and these determinants include factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and five, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. The third learning objective for the week is to identify the trend of development in international economic relations up to World War II and beyond. During the interwar period, the United States emerged. The interwar period, of course, is the period between World War I and World War II, which is somewhere between 1914 and 1945 when the World War II ended. I think World War II was between 39 and 45. So the interwar period, the United States emerged from World War I as the world's largest industrial power and the only major net creditor. Although the United States lent about $10 billion to cash short countries during the 20s, some US policies did not facilitate a return to an open liberal economy. Note that the ensuing US government policies during the 1920s are not dissimilar to today's agreement on reciprocal trade. And the concern by economists is that today's policies would lead to similar economic challenges that emanated from the 1920s. For example, the United States initially insisted that its close allies, Britain and France, repay all their war debts, and it imposed import barriers that made it difficult for Europeans to gain revenue from exports. Remember again that if someone owes you and they can't make money, they can't repay because they just don't have the income. They're not effective consumers. The 1922 Wadney-Macomber Act raised U.S. custom duties. And when the U.S. economy moved into depression after the 1929 stock market crash, the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act increased U.S. tariffs to their highest levels in the 20th century. European states retaliated with their own import restrictions, and consequently, world trade declined from 35 billion in 1929 to 12 billion in 1933. So, in the 4-year period between 1929 and 1933, the global economy contracted or shrank or got smaller from 35 billion to 12 billion. On the other hand, hegemonic stability theorists argue that the lack of a global hegemon, that means a global economic power that acts as a stabilizing force, prevented the development of an open and stable international economy during the interwar period. Let us now cover the institutional framework before World War II. As I mentioned, today's class really sets apart the framework for the rest of the week, and each week after this, we just pick little sections from this and expound on it. So, most international organizations, or IOs, formed between 1815 and 1914, of course, 1914 being when World War I ended, were designed to utilize technological innovations, promote economic regulation and commerce, mainly among European states. The first financial international organization, the Bank of International Settlements, or BIS, was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to oversee the settlement of German reparations after World War I. So German reparations, of course, is that Germany lost World War I and also lost World War II. Well, some of the damage that Germany caused during World War I, Germany was required to repay for the reconstruction of the things that it damaged during World War I. And this is mostly what the International Bank for Settlement was intended to oversee. But the main purpose was to promote but the real purpose for BIS was to promote cooperation among central banks. Of course, it ended up overseeing German reparation. Other than the BIS, economic international organizations during the interwar period, again between World War I and World War II, were mainly concerned with developing international standards for facilities, which is loans, bank transfers, etc., equipment and installations required for the functioning of the global economy. These organizations were not able to deal with major economic problems such as the Great Depression. The fourth learning objective for the week is that you should be able to explain the differences in the functions and roles of post-World War II institutions developed to manage international trade. So after World War II, the United States became clearly the dominant power, and the United States oversaw the coming to age of the current international institutions that we now see around us today, and we'll quickly go through those. In July 1944, delegates from 44 countries convened in Bretton Woods Conference. Bretton Woods is in New England, going towards Boston. And within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for a post-World War II international economic cooperation. Two international economic organizations resulted from the Bretton Woods Conference. First is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The IMF, regarded as the global lender of last resort, and in other classes we'll unpack the IMF. This is just broad overview. Uh, the IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national government and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. The stated mission of the IMF is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. While the IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II, it now plays a central role in the management of balance of payment difficulties and international financial crises. Through a quota system, countries contribute funds to a pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payment problems. In a different class, we'll get into what balance of payment is. The second institution that came from the Bretton Woods Conference, is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, which has now evolved to become one of the constituent banks of the World Bank Group. Most people assume, and incorrectly so, that the World Bank is one bank. The World Bank is actually a conglomeration of 5 different banks, and each with a differently defined mandate. But the World Bank started off as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Again, IBRD has now evolved to become one of the 5 constituent banks of the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group, colloquially referred to as the World Bank, is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to government and private institutions from low and middle income countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. The World Bank Group's vision is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. The World Bank Group is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. These 5 institutions include IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IDA. IBRD is the first one. The second one is IDA, the International Development Association. That's a bank within the World Bank. The third is IFC, the International Finance Corporation. The fourth is MIGA, MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. Fifth is ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Note that each of these 5 institutions has a different mandate. Mandate 1, partnering with governments. The IBRD and IDA form the World Bank Group's institutions that provide financing, policy advice, and technical assistance to governments of developing countries. IDA focuses on the world's poorest countries, while IBRD assists middle income and credit-worthy poorer countries. Mandate number 2, partnering with the private sector. IFC, MIGA, and ICSID focus on strengthening the private sector in developing countries. Through these institutions, the World Bank Group provides financing, technical assistance, political risk insurance, and settlement of disputes to private enterprises, including financial institutions. Now, moving on to another institution that came after World War II. Hopefully, we all know World War II ended in 1945. In 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, became the main global trade organization. GATT was set up to eliminate protectionism, get countries trading freely among themselves, and help restore economic prosperity following the devastation of World War II. Accordingly, GATT was created to form rules to end or restrict the most costly and undesirable features of the pre-war protectionist period, namely quantitative trade barriers such as trade controls and quotas. GATT also provided a system to arbitrate commercial disputes among nations. And the framework enabled a number of multilateral negotiations for the reduction of tariff barriers. However, in 1995, GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, not GATT as they many colloquially name it, was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. GATT, though largely successful in its goal, lacked a coherent institutional structure. In short, it was a legal agreement acting as an international organization. The World Trade Organization incorporates the principles of GATT and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed on issues such as intellectual property protection, as a faster dispute settlement system, and wields more power. Significantly, World Trade Organization rules are applicable to services and aspects of intellectual property, along with trading goods. The next institution, the last institution that came up after 1945, which is right in your city, New York City, is the United Nations, or the UN, which succeeded the League of Nations, and it was established after World War II, and its charter was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California, took effect on 24th October 1945. With the aim of preventing future world wars, the UN is an intergovernmental organization whose stated purpose are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It is the world's largest international organization. Let me quickly breeze through, and we're really winding down. And this is the longest class of the semester. But let me quickly breeze through a few key phrases. I did say to you, mention in earlier classes, that there are a few key phrases and words that I'd like for you to keep in mind, and that this conveys a technical knowledge uh, and subject matter expertise. The first is balance of payment, or BOP, also known as balance of international payments, is a statement of all transactions made between entities in one country and the rest of the world over a defined period, such as a quarter or a year. The two main components of a balance of payment account are current account and capital account. First, current account. A country's current account records the value of exports and imports of both goods and services. The second, capital account, is a country's capital account tracks the net balance of international investment. In other words, it keeps track of the flow of money between a nation and its foreign partners. So, as we wind down this week's very long lecture, and as I mentioned, the longest lecture of the semester, you've survived it. We're at the end of it. But let me foreshadow next week's lecture by confirming that Module 4 will be on the major institutions for managing global trade. So, congratulations for surviving this class. I am rooting for you, and I can't wait to see your assessment for the week. And with that, I'm going to turn off the recording.